Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the Wright Flyer. This is your captain speaking, and we're going to do just kind of a special program here on the Wright Flyer today. We've got our first marshal here, Mr. Nelson Ward, and it's always a privilege and an honor to have him aboard. And we're going to talk about the topic of historical revisionism, particularly with respect to the Civil War and Abraham Lincoln. You know, President Lincoln has been lionized as a supposed greatest president that the United States has ever had, but when you actually look at the true history of it and you start digging into some of the primary sources with it, you'll see that Lincoln did a lot of things that were just extra constitutional and unconstitutional. I mean, there were glaring things such as calling forth the militia without congressional approval, increasing the size of both the Army and the Navy, again, without congressional approval, expenditure of funds not appropriated to him to procure the purchase of weapons, once again, without congressional authorization, instituted a blockade, which is considered an act of war, once again, without congressional authorization or approval, and suspended the all-important writ of habeas corpus, again, without congressional authorization or approval. And if there's one thing that we can really say with respect to Lincoln, and particularly with respect to what Obama says about him, we can now see why Obama lionizes Lincoln. Lincoln was basically one of the first of these imperial presidents, and I think Nelson has some very interesting stories about Lincoln coming with respect to the Corwin Amendment, which was the original 13th Amendment, or what was slated to be the original 13th Amendment.
Yeah, the 13th Amendment, which would have been the Corwin Amendment in 1860-61, Lincoln actually had a hand in writing. Now, we hear the falsehood that Lincoln was a total abolitionist. Not true. Lincoln wrote the Corwin Amendment, which would have made protected slavery in all states. And it would actually force even further that states would have to return slaves. The Corwin Amendment, of course, it passed Congress, and the Civil War interrupted its ratification by the states. Now, Lincoln actually refers to the Corwin Amendment in his first inaugural address. And it's funny that Lincoln also refers to the Articles of Confederation, saying that the states could not leave the Union. Of course, the Articles of Confederation were made null and void by the adoption of the Constitution and the ratification. So he was speaking nonsense. He was basically an imperial, like you said, an imperial president. He was more interested in keeping the country together, forcing the states to stay within the Union, than he really was in ending slavery.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, it's interesting to see kind of the posture that he took, particularly with respect to habeas corpus. You know, that's one of the most important procedural protections safeguarded by our shared Constitution. The writ of habeas corpus is this, as we all know, procedural method by which one who is confined may be immediately released upon a finding that said confinement fails to conform with law. An example of that would be, you know, being held in prolonged detention or incarceration of a citizen without affording the citizen his or her procedural due process rights. And we actually saw this happen a couple of times with Lincoln, and it was basically Lincoln saying that he had the authority to do this just because the country was at threat. But again, there was no actual rebellion declared. In fact, the Confederacy tried to send envoys to the United States government to establish friendly relationships. They just wanted to leave. But the case of Merriman is what comes to mind for me. So on May 25th, 1861, John Merriman of Maryland was arrested by the military and confined in Fort McHenry, just outside of Baltimore. And he was held for various alleged acts of treason. And Merriman's attorney sought a writ of habeas corpus from Chief Justice Roger Taney. and he alleged that Merryman was being illegally detained at Fort McHenry without due process. And of course, the Chief Justice granted the writ and sent the marshal to General Caldwelter, who was the head or the commanding officer of the fort at that time, saying, bring the, Mr. Merryman before the court and allow us to hear this. And the general said no. No, because Lincoln had suspended the writ of habeas corpus. And Taney did something that's very rare with the Supreme Court, and this is one of the few areas where I've ever actually seen the Supreme Court attach someone in contempt. Taney actually put Caldwell in contempt, but the military turned their rifles on the marshal when he came to enact the law, and therefore they could not get the prisoner out. And so Taney basically judged his opinion, saying that only Congress could suspend the writ of habeas corpus as per Article 1, Section 9. And Nelson, I remember you had mentioned to me that you were upset with someone that had basically said that Lincoln was completely in the right to do this, going down that line of revisionism. Well, there's this one historian named Richard Nelson who came out and said that the United States Constitution in the convention, the people that were writing it, the Style Committee, just put the suspension of habeas corpus duty in Article 1, Section 9 because they had nowhere else to put it, and that meant that Lincoln could do this. And it's like, where do they come up with these arguments? It just blows my mind, because it is not within the confines of the Constitution at all.
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's like they reach up their posterior and pull out a rabbit. I just don't get where these people, I mean, they haven't read the Constitution. They don't care what the Constitution says. Let's get to the crux of the matter. When these people like Nelson speak like thus, they have no care what the Constitution says. I mean, it wasn't just wasn't Merryman, but also Clement Vallandigham, who was basically kicked out of the country for calling King Lincoln the tyrant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in fact, Lincoln sent Major General Ambrose E. Burnside, that guy that, just got people slaughtered on that bridge, not exactly the most competent military commander we ever had, but he arrested him, and Vallandigham was an anti-war copperhead, and he spoke out against Lincoln's unlawful usurpation of power, and Lincoln had actually contended that he was raising troops to fight against the United States, that Vallandigham was, but there's no evidence of it. It was just Lincoln reacting in a knee-jerk fashion to silence opposition. Basically kind of like what Obama would try and do with somebody he didn't like.
Well, Vallandigham actually had witnesses to bring up charges of treason against Lincoln. And it was. The example of the state of Missouri, where I grew up, in Taney County, Missouri. The fact is that in 1861, May of 1861, the Missouri State Legislature voted 99-1 not to secede. 3-4 days later, Lincoln ordered General Nathaniel Lyon, to invade the state of Missouri. That is treason, waging war against a state that had not seceded. They put a price on the head. In fact, he closed the state legislature, Lincoln did. He threw Governor Jackson out of his governorship. The Imperial Union forces attacked the state militia, the state guard, Missouri State Guard. They fled south to Wilson Creek Battlefield and handed Nathaniel Lyon the largest defeat west of the Mississippi, in which Nathaniel Lyon was killed. Mm-hmm. I mean, the total misunderstanding or the out-and-out lies about Lincoln. Lincoln committed treason against the United States. The Constitution is pretty clear. You attack one state, Article 4, Section 4, you attack one state, you attack all states. And that's how the Constitution works. And the federal government is obligated to protect those states from invasion. even against their own country.
Right, right. And it's interesting to note because a lot of what we've seen with respect to the Confederacy in the aftermath of what happened with Dillon Storm Roof at that Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church, I've seen a lot of discussion, basically claiming that the Confederacy is the equivalent to Nazi Germany in America. But I know that my great great uncle's military unit, he was with the Ninth Texas Confederate Cavalry, they were actually riding up to try and help and assist the Missouri State Guard. And that was why they fought at the Battle of what the Union calls Pea Ridge and what Confederates called Elkhorn Tavern, which was there in Arkansas. As they were heading up, they were cut off by the lower half of the Union forces. The northern half was still up in Missouri and in those areas, but people forget that there was this real strain of camaraderie that existed, especially between a lot of the states that seceded later, and particularly with the border states. Kentucky itself was not well treated. Missouri was horribly treated by the Union. And we see that actually in Missouri, you had a lot of the tensions build up before Lincoln even started anything with the Kansas Jayhawkers running around and creating violence. You basically had the war between the states break out early on, and again, Lincoln just exacerbated those problems. And like you said, he held a farce election, having the troops go in and make elections occur in Missouri, but barred people from their own homes, destroyed property, confiscated property, and he excused this by saying that, well, it's a time of war, and when you are a warring party, you don't pay for what you collect. But how does that work when it's your own citizens? That makes no sense to me. None.
Well, the start of the Civil War actually started with the Kansas-Missouri border war.
Mm-hmm.
You're correct. The Kansas Jayhawkers invaded. They started this. They invaded the state of Missouri. They wanted to have a state that was a non-slave state. Fine and dandy. There's your right to vote that in. To come all the way into the Ozarks and attack, rape, pillage, burn. It's amazing what the Kansas Jayhawkers did. Governor Sterling Price, and I don't know how many people are familiar. The only time I've seen Sterling Price depicted in a movie was in The Undefeated with John Wayne, and it was Rock Hudson who actually depicted Sterling Price with a fake, really bad Southern accent. Sterling Price was from northern Missouri, so he didn't have a Southern accent. The fact is, guys, Price petitioned the governor, petitioned the federal government under Article 4, Section 4, to send federal troops in. In the 1850s, he petitioned both Presidents Pierce and Buchanan to send federal troops in under obligation under Article 4, Section 4, to protect the state of Missouri from invasion, to stop the border war, and both presidents, Pierce and Buchanan, ignored him. I've seen the letters personally. They are sitting in the state capitol. And, of course, how many are aware that after the war, Price collected a number of American citizens who were done. They were done with the United States. They were done with the violations of the Constitution. They picked up and moved to Mexico.
Mm-hmm. Right, right. And, you can draw some parallels from what was happening at that time to kind of what we're seeing with this federal government now, especially when it comes to securing our border, especially when it comes to encroaching upon our fundamental and unalienable right to keep and bear firearms. We see it with, the immediate aftermath of the San Bernardino attacks. Once again, Obama's out there calling for the confiscation of firearms, and Josh Earnest is out there preaching to the media that it's Obama would visit the site because he frequently visits sites of gun violence, completely ignoring the Islamo-fascist aspect of it. And it reminds me a little bit of they are ignoring the truth, just like, Pierce and Buchanan were with respect to what was happening with the border war between Kansas and Missouri. And it makes me a bit worried because when you ignore things like that, you see it boil over into something worse. And we certainly see that Obama has this deep affinity for Lincoln. And Lincoln didn't just stop there. In fact, when Taney had said that Article 1, Section 9 said that he couldn't suspend the writ of habeas corpus without congressional approval, I believe it was in that case where Lincoln tried to have the Chief Justice arrested. And correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't it Seward that basically stepped in and said, no, if you do that, you'll have all the states rebelling?
Exactly. Actually, it was Seward and the Attorney General who stood up to Lincoln. Lincoln himself wrote an arrest warrant for Roger Taney. The president can't write an arrest warrant for anyone in this country. He doesn't have the authority to do so. Yeah. He wrote an arrest warrant, and Seward and I think his name was McDonald at the time.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Told Lincoln, you do this, and you'll not only have the entire country, all states in rebellion, you will be assassinated within the month. How correct were they?
Oh, they were about, 3.5 to 4 years off? Just a little bit, because that was spring of 61, and he was assassinated in, early summer of 65?
April 14th?
Yeah, spring. Yeah, so we're talking May of 61 to April of 65, so yeah, not even a full 4 years later. Wow. That's incredible.
It's amazing, too. For a president, I mean, people say that Obama's the worst president in United States history. They're not even close. Not even close. We have over 650,000 Americans on both sides in the military that died in the Civil War. That's not counting the almost 1 million civilians that died because of the Civil War. Nathaniel Lyon, he murdered over 2,500 American citizens that were not in rebellion in 1 month, and burned over 1,200 homes on his march to Springfield, Missouri. Of course, that's a 200-mile march, but he burned everything on the way. Right. Luckily, he was killed.
Yeah, and that was the thing. When you looked at the way that war was waged, with Sherman even, I know that seems cliched, but it was actually Sherman that had wiped out my great-great-uncle's company of the 9th Texas. In fact, it was the company after his. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie with Clint Eastwood, the outlaw Josie Wales, but when think back to the scene where he's in Texas at the drugstore, little general store there, and they mentioned Bob Lee raising hell in Bonham. Well, Bonham, Texas is where my great-great-uncle was from, and Bob Lee was in the 9th Texas, just the company below my great-great-uncle. And my great-great-uncle was the commander of his company, and they were wiped out in Atlanta. And it's just interesting to see how devastating that war was, and to know that war could have been avoided. It absolutely could have been avoided had the president been reined in, had he not gone these extra constitutional routes. And we could see that he constantly was reaching out for power for himself, constantly looking for a way to work around Congress. I mean, even the initial blockade that he did against the Confederacy, that was considered an act of war. And he did that before there was any belligerency. The Confederacy only opened fire on Fort Sumter after he was resupplying the fort. In fact, there was I believe it was a group of cadets that had fired on the ships coming up after they had said, go back, and the Union ships just kept pushing through. That was considered an act of war. And it was an act of war without a declaration of war by Congress, and that is a huge violation of the Constitution.
Well, absolutely. But here's what's never taught. In the late fall of 1860, Buchanan sent federal troops into South Carolina to seize the South Carolina State Guard and their armory. So they seized their means to defend themselves.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly what Obama wants to do.
And isn't
It's amazing. It's amazing that's never taught.
right?
That was unconstitutional right there.
Mm-hmm. And and it's amazing too when you consider the revolutions that have happened in the history. You look at the American Revolution. What did it start over? When did the shots actually start firing? It was when they went to go get the guns at Lexington and Concord. You skip forward to 1835, October of 1835, the little town of Gonzales, what was then Coahuila y Tejas. You had the basically the troops of Antonio Lopez de Santana coming up to seize what? Their cannon and their guns. And that started this Texas Revolution, Texas War of Independence. And so I'm seeing this similar pattern. It's always an oppressive government, always reaching out to take out the means to defend yourselves. And that's always the last straw. And we now know that Obama, with respect to San Bernardino, is trying to go forward with these illegal executive actions to take away what he deemed assault weapons. And I hate that term because it's so vague and ambiguous. It can be used to mean anything. You can construe a BB gun to be an assault weapon. You could construe a plastic spork from Kentucky Fried Chicken to be an assault weapon, especially if it came with one of those salt packets. That would really make it an assault weapon. But you get my point.
Well, here's the fact. Here's kind of off the topic, but there was an assault weapon. It was called the Sturmgewehr. It was called the STG 44. It was created by Nazi Germany. It was the one and only assault weapon ever created because Sturmgewehr means assault weapon in German.
Mm-hmm.
Here's what. Now let's make this clear. None of us support slavery. Slavery was a disgusting institution. It should have been. We wish that slavery would have been abolished when they created the Constitution. They just couldn't accomplish it. There was too much division between the states. Lincoln did not support the 13th Amendment, the one we have now to abolish slavery originally. Here we have Republicans saying that Lincoln was a Republican. He ran as a Republican in his first term. His second term, he was not a Republican. He was a Unionist. Actually, the Republican, let's see, what it would be...
John Fremont.
John Fremont. Thank you, Jeremy. John Fremont was actually nominated by the Republican Party. Lincoln threatened his life, and in late September of 1864, he pulled out of the race.
Mm-hmm. And wasn't he also involved in Missouri, if I remember right, and was trying to basically temper Lyons and what Lyons was doing, or am I getting that mixed up with another one?
John Fremont was actually a major general in Missouri. He was actually stationed in Missouri over Union troops.
He resigned.
He resigned from that, and then he actually took leadership or command over another regiment, which later he resigned from that as well, and that's when he ran against Lincoln. And Fremont was actually an abolitionist. He was actually the first Republican candidate that was an abolitionist.
Absolutely. John Fremont supported the 13th Amendment, the abolition of slavery. Lincoln opposed it until after his election in January of 1865. Now, he wrote in 1863. He wrote in 1860. Yes?
I was just going to say that, Lincoln actually kind of did a backdoor deal with trying to kind of like a smack in the face to Fremont with the Emancipation Proclamation that actually perpetuated this whole thing on slavery and was used as propaganda.
Well, we hear the propaganda of slavery and race. How many are aware that over 10% of all slave owners were black? The 1860 census is pretty clear. 4.2% of whites of all slave owners lived in the slave states. 4.2% of the population of slave owners, slave states, were slave owners. In Missouri, 2.1% of the population were slave owners. Only 2% of those, over 10%, were black. Why is that never addressed? Why will no one ever call out the fact that there were some of the largest slaveholders in the United States, including a woman in Louisiana, which was the largest slaveholder in the state of Louisiana, was a black woman. Now, we keep hearing the lies that blacks couldn't own property. That's a lie. That women couldn't own property. That's a lie. Here's a black woman in Louisiana that owned the most slaves of anybody in Louisiana.
And she was able to do that through inheritance because she actually married into the aristocracy. That way, the original owner of that property could actually have more children to carry on his bloodline.
And you know, it's interesting. If my memory serves me correctly, the first slave owner in America was actually black. I do believe that was the case in Virginia, and I'm a bit rusty on it, but if I'm not mistaken, I think the first slave owner in America was actually black.
Yes, he actually sued. Actually, it was Maryland. He sued the British Crown in court and to allow him to own slaves. A black man. A black man sued the British Crown to allow the first slaves in the British New World.
Yeah, and see, that's not taught in the history. It just goes to show that the history of this country has been perverted and bastardized by these people that have this radical extremist left-wing ideology, and they are so committed to it that they don't care what the truth is. Going back to what you had mentioned with those that misquote the Constitution, or those historians that disagree with it. And there was actually a piece written by one of the military tribunal judges during the Bush administration that had been called to be on one of those military tribunal things. And he had written this piece basically trying to compare what Bush was doing at Gitmo with what was happening with Lincoln's suspension of the writ of habeas corpus. But, you know, that's a major difference when you are dealing with a foreign, illegal criminal combatant that's not wearing a recognized uniform, that is not differentiating or distinguishing itself from civilians, than to do it to a civilian political opponent who just happened to call you a king and a tyrant. And it's just funny to see to the lengths that they will go to say, well, maybe he was a little too quick to brush aside the Constitution. But this judge, and I'm sorry that I'm drawing a blank on his name, but this judge actually said that it is okay to push away the Constitution to save the Constitution. Really? Really?
It needs to be disbarred.
Yeah. Not only disbarred, it needs to be brought up on federal charges.
Yeah.
How many times do we see judges violate the Constitution to enforce the Constitution? They're claimed to enforce the Constitution. How many times do we say it? Guys, how many times have you seen online where some idiot says that the Supreme Court has the authority to interpret the Constitution, when the Ninth Amendment plainly says in fifth grade English that the Constitution cannot be interpreted to
disparage,
to bend any of the enumerations in the Constitution.
Yeah.
And that's the problem, because a lot of people seem to think that there's rights that are not enumerated in the Constitution. They have extra rights that aren't listed in the Constitution. That's where people don't understand that the Ninth Amendment specifically says that the enumeration of certain rights in the Constitution shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. The people are the only ones that have rights. They're the only entity mentioned in the Constitution where rights are applied and attached. All these same idiots online that want to say, well, the Supreme Court, says they can interpret the Constitution. That's their job. Those same idiots seem to think that the federal government has rights, that states have rights.
Well, Jeremy, it's not just online. You know, Marxist dubious Rubio came out the other day and was saying, with respect to what Ted Cruz had voted against with the NSA warrantless snooping program, he said that it took away the government's right to scoop up all this metadata without obtaining a warrant. I'm sorry, but government doesn't have rights. Government
delegated
cannot
authority.
Have rights. Yeah.
It's delegated authorities and powers. And who are they delegated by? We the people. Again, solidifying the fact that the people are the only ones that have rights.
Mm-hmm. Well, and in Lincoln saying that, going back to the subject, Lincoln said that the states had no authority to dissolve their attachment to the Union. Where does it say that in the Constitution? There is nothing in the Constitution that says the states cannot secede or dissolve any ties they have to the Union. It does allude to that in the Articles of Confederation, saying that once in the Union, always in the Union, but the Articles of Confederation no longer had any authority. As I said before, the adoption and the ratification of the Constitution made the Articles of Confederation null and void. So Lincoln was reaching in a bag of goodies for another lie. It's amazing that how is this ever taught in school anymore? We were taught in school in Missouri.
It's the same fact. It's the same fact that what's being taught in schools is that Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. Now, I specifically and directly asked one of my college professors in front of other fellow classmates. In fact, I asked not only her, but several of my fellow classmates as a whole, who freed the slaves? Their answer was Abraham Lincoln. And I told them that's wrong. And they wanted to argue with me about it. Bad idea. For the simple fact, and this is exactly what I told them, how is it possible that somebody could have freed the slaves when the 13th Amendment is the only thing that abolished slavery, and that wasn't ratified to the Constitution until 8 months after Lincoln had been shot in the head. So unless Lincoln came back from the grave and did this on his own, he didn't free anybody. The fact of the matter is, Emancipation Proclamation, which is not what's taught in school, is the fact that it is an executive order. And Nelson, you reminded me earlier on a phone conversation we had that it specifically says right in the Emancipation Proclamation that it is an executive order. That was just their fancy way of saying executive order. That's all it is. And executive orders carry no weight as law on the citizens or individual states.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the Emancipation Proclamation was Lincoln overstepping his bounds. You are aware, too, that the Emancipation Proclamation has no authority under the federal government. Mm-hmm. So in states that had not seceded, it had no authority. It only had authority over an autonomous country. That would be like Obama writing an executive order on China, saying, well, China has to stop all this pollution. And China could look at him and tell him to get bent because there's nothing to do about it.
Or if he was to say that to Afghanistan or Iraq, they would just simply tell him to go Farouk himself. Couldn't resist.
I know. But, looking at what Lincoln did and looking at the way that he just clamped down on the freedoms of the people. The other thing that he also did was he did the first income tax, again, without congressional authority or with a constitutional amendment. It was just this lockstep movement towards more and more and more concentration of power and authority into the hands of the central government, which is actually diametrically opposed to the way that our founding fathers envisioned the tenets of federalism working in this country. I mean, he basically took federalism and destroyed it. He made it despotism.
Well, how many quotes have you seen people post on Lincoln? Lincoln said this of the Constitution. He was the biggest violator of the Constitution in American history. Yet people continually post one quote from Lincoln after another. It's an amazing complete opposite of the facts. Lincoln was a tyrant. Lincoln was a traitor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now there's some arguments that many people have claimed that, you know, Lincoln did what he did in order to keep the Union together, because there was Spain, Great Britain, various other countries just kind of waiting off our shores during the Civil War for, you know, the country to become so divisive that they would be able to come in and just swoop up, you know, swaths of land, thinking they can, you know, break us apart and forever end the United States. I could understand to a certain degree Lincoln doing that, but it doesn't make it right. The fact of the matter is he violated the Constitution, and this goes back again to what we were saying about the judges violating the Constitution in order to uphold it. It's counterintuitive. A violation of the Constitution is a violation of the Constitution. The law is the law, and the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. I don't care what the impetus of it is or what the grand scheme behind it is to preserve the Union. That's no excuse. You do not violate the rights of citizens, period.
Well, I mean, we hear the same thing from Trump that we hear from Obama. If I can get my way, I'll just use executive order. He thinks he can bypass Congress just like Obama, and the Trump supporters will sit there and lie and say he didn't say it. You know, they will say the sun doesn't rise in the east and set in the west if Trump says it so. And it's amazing. It's the same thing. It's Obama nation all over again. That Obama speaks, and his little followers will echo whatever he says and say it is freaking law. I mean, on this Muslim thing, we want to ban Muslims from going to the United States. You know how dangerous a precedent that sets? If people will stop for 1 second and go, if they can ban Muslims, they can ban Christians and Jews from coming into the United States. In fact, let's see. Let's go look through history and see that there was a president that banned Jews from coming to the United States. That would be FDR.
As well as Japanese and Germans and Italians and so on and so forth.
He had to stand firm on his principles. Oh, wait, is that too soon that he couldn't stand? Sorry.
Well, yeah, the thing about it is, though, we were in a war with Jews. In fact, they said they were trying to save the Jews, which was an absolute lie. I mean, FDR refused to take over 1 million Jews when they were offered by the Nazis. The Nazis offered to turn loose over 1 million Jews into the hands of the United States just to get rid of them because they had no place. They couldn't even kill them fast enough. And FDR said, well, we don't want them. So they just let another 1 million Jews, mostly from Austria and Hungary, just be butchered. And, of course, who was behind half of that, or some of that? That would be George Soros.
Yep, the same mastermind who, after the BP oil spill, basically got all of our offshore drilling rigs and sent them to his company down there in Brazil. You know, the
Petrobras.
Yeah, Petrobras. Gosh, that sounds dirty, but yeah, it's these same types of nefarious things that we see over and over again. And you know, going back to this idea of Lincoln and what Lincoln did, people always forget this famous quote of his it's the one quote you never really see him use. It's, if I could save the Union without freeing a single slave, I'd do it. If I could do it with freeing all the slaves, I could do it. If I could do it with freeing some and not others, I'd do it. But what he was really speaking to there was, if I could secure my power, my stranglehold grip on the country, no matter what, I'd do it. That's what that really translates to and means.
Well, and that's pure tyranny right there. Is what it speaks as. He'll do whatever, a tyrant will do whatever he can to maintain and control power.
Right. He wanted to make himself an imperial president, just like the one we have now. But then again, he killed 650,000 people. Actually, he had another million, like I said before, another million civilians.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole Civil War was not fought over slavery. Slavery is a small part of it. It was a contributing factor. Yes, it was a contributing factor. But states' authority was and the 10th Amendment was the largest. We're having the same problem right now. We're having the states saying, well, you can't do what you're doing to the states. You don't have that authority, and Obama's going, well, I'll just cut your money off. And then the states are going to acquiesce because they're greedy, hungry, so-and-sos.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a huge fight right now with the Syrian refugee thing. I know that our state just dropped the suit because finally the federal government gave them the information that they wanted with it, and that was what they were trying to use as the avenue around the law. But they're trying to shove more refugees all around this country. And again, that you have to wonder, where again does the Constitution give the president the authority to shove all these so-called refugees in the country over the objections of the states? Because I don't remember that being within the Constitution itself. I remember that being in a law that is being broadly interpreted, that Refugee Act, that's a rather poorly written law, but the way that Obama's interpreting it and the way that he's going with it is vastly expansive, vastly contrary to what's contained in the four corners of that law. And that's kind of the problem that we're facing right now, and it's parallel to what had happened in America in the days leading up to the Civil War. We have this problem of selective enforcement of the law, selective interpretation of the law, and reinterpretation of the law to such a degree that we don't have a legal system or legal code or laws at all. It's all meaningless, and we're seeing chaos and damn near anarchy as a result.
Well, at what point, as I've said before, at what point does the federal government violate the Constitution to the point that they're illegitimate under the Constitution? They did so under the Civil War. I think they did so again during the Wilson administration. They damn sure did during the FDR administration. You can't take American citizens and put them in an internment camp. No. He did so without congressional authority. You see over and over, you see Bill Clinton attacking American citizens there in Texas. I don't care if those people thought that unicorns flew out their butts. They had not been convicted of anything. In fact, they were falsely accused of all kinds of things, from child molestation, illegal guns, which is a lie because they had two FFL holders on the property. Where there's methamphetamines, which is another lie. You might not agree with somebody's religious convictions, but that doesn't mean you can kill them. Now, when it comes to Islam, we are at war. Now, FDR prohibited any Germans, any Italians, and any Japanese from coming into the country. He had that authority under the War Act. Well, they didn't have a War Powers Act, but the War Act of 1867. He did have the authority under that act. There was a declared war by Congress. Congress gave him the authority to prosecute that war. So he could actually eliminate. Here's the problem, guys. Here's the problem. When you exclude one factor, one set of immigration, it's unconstitutional. If they would eliminate, here's where Trump seems to miss the boat, and Ted Cruz actually mentioned it. They have the authority to get rid of immigration or suspend immigration altogether. That's where they should be going. If you want to go and follow the Constitution, suspend immigration, suspend all refugee entrance in the United States, period, until we can sort this out.
Sure, sure. And see where FDR, even though he had the authority to prevent them from coming here from Germany, Italy, and Japan, where he overstepped his bounds was, again, putting American citizens, not only American citizens that were of German descent or Japanese or Italian descent, but also their families who were not of that descent, that were natural-born American citizens from the get-go, and their families have been here for 200 years.
Mm-hmm.
He just it was guilt by association. He just rounded them all up and put them in internment camps. That's where he screwed the pooch on that, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because that's basically a corruption of blood type thing.
Exactly.
And that was the Nisei with the Japanese. I actually had the honor of knowing one who fought in Germany, who was from this area, talking about how the soldiers told them that they were protecting them, and he asked, well, how are they protecting us by pointing the guns at us in the camps? We happen to know that the bullet flies out that end, and that's not protecting us. But he was actually mad that he couldn't go fight in Asia because he wanted to fight against the Japanese. He said they were the ones that attacked us. They were the ones that caused the government to act this way. But it does go to show that FDR, he had this thing that he called the kitchen cabinet, that little group of ministers he had that worked in the smoke-filled back rooms to get his New Deal policies in place. That's where it really first got started. And then a bunch of his War Powers Acts that he was doing during the course of the war. He did all of that to bypass Congress because, just like Lincoln, he thought Congress took too long and that he could do it faster, he could do it better, because he knew better. And isn't that always the pattern that we see with these potentates that sit there and bring in centralization with the government, that they always follow this pattern of they think they know best, and they want it to be faster, 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 crisis all the time just to get their way?
Well, sorry, Jeremy. Maybe Congress doesn't want to do it. Maybe Congress wouldn't pass it, period.
Mm-hmm.
Congress would find out, well, let's see, look at the Constitution. Where's that authority to do so? And that's one of the first lines of defense in our government. When they pass a bill, Congress should be examining that bill and see if they have the authority to start with. I mean, that's what it started out being. We saw Davy Crockett, the guy that used to have on Wonderful World of Disney. But the fact is, he stood up as a representative from the state of Tennessee and basically said, Congress doesn't have the authority to do this. Congress doesn't have the authority to do that. And I'm not going to vote it, nor I'm going to stand for it.
Yeah, and they actually chased him out for that. That's why he came to Texas and fought at the Alamo. And if they weren't going to accept him, the Texians did, and he's now part of our lore. But yeah, you're absolutely right that he was standing up to this type of governmental power grab, and people forget just how early on we had this fight between, I'm going to use the old terms of the Federalists and Anti-Federalists because it really does play down to those two factions. We still have those two factions. It's this competing ideologies of, well, how much power do we concentrate in the hands of the federal government? If you're going to follow the Alexander Hamilton philosophy, you're going to be squarely in Obama's camp, although I think even Obama would stretch it past what Hamilton would want, even though he did want a national brewery to be funded by taxpayers. But you had that as opposed to this kind of true constitutional federalist system as envisioned by James Madison, which was really bolstered by George Mason. And that is kind of this, what they don't consider the establishment wing of the gutless opposition party. What was originally the Tea Party movement, which that's all died away, and because it got infiltrated and kind of fell apart. But we still have this decentralized view versus a centralized view. It's basically statist versus non-statist. And Lincoln was a statist, FDR was a statist, LBJ was a statist, and we see what the statists get us. Just abject misery.
Well, I mean, we can even see this going on now with our presidential candidates. Mm-hmm. I'm hearing people from the Trump camp, and I call them the Trumpeteers, because, well, if Disney was to formulate some kind of kid show based on Donald Trump, that's what exactly would it be. And the thing is, you have people from the Trump camp now using left-wing rhetoric to say that, well, you know, all these Cruz bots are coming out, and all these supporters of Ted Cruz, you know, they're wanting him, and he's ineligible to be president, and all this other stuff. They're even attacking Ted Cruz on the way that he votes in the Senate. Now, Ted Cruz voted a certain way for certain legislation because they couldn't read it. They weren't allowed to see it. He had to vote it in this, and I think this is actually akin to what Nancy Pelosi said. Well, we have to pass it before we can find out what's in it. So now that's been set as a precedent of now passing legislation. They're keeping it private and classified until it's voted on.
Yeah, that was the TPA and TPP.
Yes,
those trade agreements.
And you have people that are staunch supporters of Donald Trump say, well, we like Ted Cruz. He's by far, you know, the most conservative, but, you know, he's ineligible, so we have to vote for Trump. Well, the thing is, people don't understand the very simple principle of this. Number one, you align yourself with a candidate that has your core principles and values in mind. Now, people can vote for whoever they want. I don't care who anybody votes for, but just know what you're voting for. That's the thing. That's the ticket behind this. People are voting for Trump because, well, I like what he's having to say and this and that. But the fact of the matter is, Trump is not a constitutionalist. Trump doesn't care about the United States. The only thing Trump cares about is Trump. And he even has his own, he's even come out and attacked Ted Cruz, calling him a maniac. Yeah. Now, how is this going to solve this problem of people being divisive? Because we're seeing what's happened in 2008, 2012. Instead of it coming from the left this time, it's coming from people that support Trump. And they're doing the exact same thing that they railed against, saying, well, we're not going to stand for that. The left is always attacking and trying to divide people. They're doing the same thing that the left has always done. That makes them no different than the left.
Well, Trump is like a paranoid narcissist who would file a complaint against himself for stalking.
Yeah.
I mean, it's ridiculous. What I don't understand. They say the Trumpsters are saying that Cruz is for amnesty. Trump has already said, he said this plainly and clearly that anybody should understand that illegal aliens can leave the country and then come back. Under federal law, they can't. Once they leave the country, they can never come back, ever. They can never be citizens, and they can never cross that border again. They're felons. So I don't understand. Sure. We're seeing Obama all over again. And you know the difference between Trump and Obama. Trump doesn't have the tan.
Yeah.
And worse hair. The other thing is Trump can't speak worth a darn. Well, neither can Obama. But one of the things that Trump tried to say today in one of his attacks against Ted Cruz was that, you know, Ted Cruz is basically too abrasive. He goes into the Senate, you know, there's that maniac statement, but, you know, you just can't go into the Senate and say those crazy types of things and get away with it and think that you can make friends. Well, Trump, what the hell are you doing in your campaign? Hasn't your entire campaign just been a bunch of bloviating nonsense that's way out there in wacko land? I'm not going to catch the train to Crazy Town with you, Trump, because you're a little too out there for me.
Well, on one side of his mouth he said, well, I love the Hispanic people, I love the Mexicans, well, let's throw them out. I mean, that is sociopathic. Ted Cruz who's the only person that's running who's actually defended the Constitution? Ted Cruz, successful Texas. He was the Solicitor General who fought for the Constitution and fought for the authorities of the state in the Supreme Court and continually won. What has Trump done? Trump has paid off a bunch of his buddies. Now listen to this, guys. We can correlate all these people together, but how often can you declare Chapter 11 in bankruptcy? How often? Every 7 years?
Yeah.
How did Trump do that 4 times in 11 years?
Because of his sister, who was a judge.
And he paid off politicians to do so.
Yep. And then, of course, he tries to lie and say, it wasn't me, it was my corporation. Really? Really? Who was the primary shareholder? Was this a privately traded corporation?
Trump.
Yeah,
Trump
it was closely held. So they could pierce that corporate veil and say, hey, look, it's actually an alter ego of you, Trump.
Yeah, it's the mirror image. It's the ghost Trump. It's amazing, guys. How many people don't seem to understand this? They attack Trump for filing Chapter 11 because Chapter 11 is what corporations file. You can't file Chapter 13 or Chapter 7 if you have over $330,000 of assets. You have to file Chapter 11. That's how the bankruptcy law works. Now, let's see. What kind of court is a bankruptcy court? It's not a
Article 1.
It's
not an Article 3 court. It's an Article 1 court under the authority of Congress. Congress has total authority over bankruptcy. The Supreme Court has no authority at all over bankruptcy. So, here we have Trump, who is mirroring Obama, who mirrored Lincoln, saying that, well, I can do whatever I want to. I can violate any federal law I want to. I get the benefits of bending the law or breaking the law and being able to file Chapter 11 4 times between 1991 and 2002. 4 times.
Yeah. And see, the other reason that he, even if he could have filed Chapter 7, he wouldn't have wanted to, because that's what is known as liquidation bankruptcy. It means he would have had to get rid of the company. Well, Chapter 11 is basically a reorganization bankruptcy, and it's basically where you can play this little shell game with your creditors. And he would do that just to escape obligations, to then pour it back into his company when he went and did these kind of illicit eminent domain things with his sister, who was appointed by whom? Bill Clinton. Now we see the connection as to why he originally said that Hillary Clinton would actually be a good president. I remember him saying this a couple of years back. And see, that's the thing with Trump. How can a person go from saying that they support universal health care, that they support an assault weapons ban, that they support all this left-wing radical stuff, and then the next day say, well, I'm a conservative, and, I support the Second Amendment, and, yeah, we need to roll back Obamacare and go to a private system, when he was out there advocating universal health care for years. People don't just diametrically change like that. It's not like he had a come to Jesus meeting. It's more like he had a come to Satan meeting. Let's find a way to basically hoodwink the people, because that's what he's trying to do.
It all goes back to tying into Lincoln. Mm-hmm. Lincoln ran claiming not for abolition of slavery, but support of the Corwin Amendment to stop the abolition of slavery. So here we have, it repeats itself. People don't want to learn the history. We've seen this first with Lincoln. Well, actually, we saw it first with Jackson, and then with Lincoln, and then we saw it again with Wilson, and then we saw it again with FDR. We saw it again with Johnson, and then we saw it with Clinton, and we saw it with Obama. Now, none of the presidents in between, except for maybe, I would say, one, had ever done it. One was a Democrat and one was a Republican. We have Cleveland and Coolidge, whoever did anything to stop this. And I am sick to death of seeing people on their knees at the altar of Ronald Reagan. If people will actually look at his second term, it pretty much, with the exception of, getting the Russians to back down and running them out of money, well, they're back, aren't they? So that really worked well, but it's pretty much mirrors George Bush. Let's not forget that Reagan illegally signed amnesty. Amnesty is ex post facto law, is unconstitutional, even when Reagan signed it. We have so many things put into the Firearms Protection Act. Well, let's see, that prohibited you buying a fully automatic firearm, which you keep hearing from people going, oh, you can't buy a machine gun. Yes, you can. You can buy one with a $200 freaking tax if you can afford one. But that Firearm Owners Protection Act limited people to carry a firearm within 1,000 feet of a school. Even if you live next door, even if you were driving down the street, you could be arrested. And of course, the Firearms Owners Protection Act said that you could not own a fully automatic weapon that was built after 1986. And then you had several others. In fact, some of the EPA measures that we're suffering under now for this fraudulent global warming crap was put in by Reagan.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, and now you've got a Surgeon General that Obama wants to appoint that sits there and says that guns are a public health issue. Don't you love that? They treat it like a disease. I never knew that an inanimate object was a virus or a bacteria or a disease. The only disease I'm seeing here is the twisted machinations of these statists that want to deprive us of our fundamental and unalienable rights. And, they're just going to keep trying to double down on this because they sense that the so-called opposition party, what I call the gutless opposition party, our dear sweet GOP, is not going to do a blessed thing to stop any of this. They're not going to. They're going to sit there and tap dance and still give them whatever they want. In fact, Benedict Arnold, Paul Ryan, along with Mitch the Turtle McConnell, at least according to Jeff Sessions, are bending over and doing handstands to make sure that we get funding, taxpayer funding, for Obama's Syrian refugee resettlement program. Gee, that's smart. That's a good idea. That's in line with what the people want, right? No.
Well,
how many times see Congress? Congress had a chance. You see the false pretext of natural-born citizenship. Well, we've all read the 1790 Naturalization Act. So he's good to go, folks. I don't care what anyone says. I've read the act. His mother was an American citizen. It's done. His father was a resident of the United States at one time. That's all he had to be, a resident at one time of the United States. That says nothing else other than that. It's the only time they've addressed, anyone has addressed, including the court, natural-born citizen as it pertains to Article 2 of the Constitution. It's done. It's settled law. It's been settled law for 220 years.
It's still valid law because it has not been repealed or overturned.
Absolutely. It's still the law of the land. But the fact is, how many people missed the whole deal that Obama was covering up? How many people missed that? Obama attended college for hundreds of thousands of dollars illegally by defrauding the federal government and claiming he was a foreign citizen. We know that for a fact because we have we've seen his actual college IDs, which says right on there, foreign citizen. Well, gee, if you're defrauding the government and you're not a foreign citizen, and who's brought up this? Who has brought up this every time? It's been the freaking left wing, including Donald Trump, because he's a left winger. He's not changed. A leopard does not change its stripes. Doesn't happen.
Well, it's always with the left with this natural-born citizen crap. They did it with Goldwater. They did it with McCain. They did it with Romney, or tried to do it with Romney. That fell flat on its face about 2 seconds afterwards. And now they're doing it with Cruz, saying, well, he was born in Canada. Well, the fact of the matter is, again, the Naturalization Act that we spoke of is still the law of the land. Therefore, you have to apply that to it. I don't care what other naturalization laws come into play and what they say, that law has still never been overturned. So, and this is all coming from the Trump camp. There's individuals that speak about, this is a long time coming, we knew this was coming. No, Hillary Clinton started this crap this last go round with Obama. Philip Berg, one of her close attorney friends, is the one who actually filed the first lawsuit, in fact, did file the very first lawsuit against the eligibility of Obama. Now, what happened with that? The courts shot it down. They made their ruling on it and says it has no valid stance. It has no standing. Therefore, any other challenge that comes from that will fall into that, and the courts would have to look at that and say, well, no, we ruled on it this way, we can't change the ruling on this. They have to go with it has no standing, because it's already made that precedent established.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's always this type of argument that you see from the left, and it's not just the left, Jeremy. We've got that little nitwit Ann Coulter came out and said that Ted Cruz wasn't a natural-born citizen. But hey, hasn't Ann Coulter been a great picker of winners lately? I mean, she thought Romney was going to be our best bet twice, 2 times in a row.
Yeah.
Romney hasn't been good for anything, but it's always that way with these people that want to push for centralized control, for greater governmental control. They always go and do these outlandish schemes to discredit whoever they're going against, and if that doesn't work, then they threaten them, like Lincoln did with the nominee, the nominee for the Republican Party in 1864, and I'm drawing a blank on his name again already, but it's what Nelson mentioned. Because he was actually an abolitionist, and that actually threatened Lincoln's chances of getting in, Lincoln went after him.
John Fremont.
Yeah, John Fremont. He absolutely went after him. And it's funny to think about that, because people are like, well, Barry Soetoro or Barack Obama was the first to engage in this kind of targeted attacks from the bully pulpit to the point of chasing people out of the political arena, or marginalizing them or making them persona non grata. No, Lincoln was the first master of that. Absolutely, he was.
Well, we can even go back before Lincoln and go back to John Adams with the Alien Sedition Act as well. We've talked about that before.
Yeah.
So, again, it's the whole thing. And ultimately what it boils down to is the American voting populace has become so complacent, so dumbed down because of political correctness. And Trump is always saying, we're not going to be politically correct about this. What he's doing, he's using the idea of not being politically correct to subvert the voting base, is what he's doing. Because they're the ones, it's coming from his camp, that they want to utilize this stuff of, well, we're not going to be politically correct. They're so dumbed down, he has people convinced, just like Romney had people convinced, with all these people say, well, we have to vote for him because he's the only choice we have. No. People are looking for someone to save them. You cannot look for someone to save you. You have to be willing and accept the responsibility to save yourself. Trump isn't going to save anybody. Again, why? Because Trump doesn't care about anybody but Trump. Period. Ted Cruz is the only viable candidate, and even Ted Cruz has some discrepancies and I don't want to agree with everybody 100%. If that was the case, I would run. In fact, I'm more eligible than Trump is to a certain degree, because he doesn't even understand the Constitution.
Well, I don't get, guys. We go, let's start out on Lincoln, but the Republican Party is corrupt to the core, guys. I mean,
Yeah.
how many times have we seen in your elections? We saw in Mississippi that the Republican Party is willing to use Democrats to defeat a conservative. We
Yep.
saw in the Republican convention that Mitt Romney and his little gang of Karl Rove just created brand new rules that if they don't like what the delegates vote, they could change their votes or eliminate them altogether. I can't stand the Ron Paul and Medina tards, but the fact is they had the right to have their voice. They had the right to cast their votes for whomever they wanted to. If he won those delegates, they had the right to cast those votes for the delegates. And when you can tell the delegates you can't vote or you have to vote for whomever we tell you to, other than the constituents that voted, so the delegates represent their constituents, just like a representative does, and to cast that vote the way the constituents voted. They don't absolutely have to, but it's pretty much common practice. And
But
Romney could, and his little gang of buddies could change the whole convention and say, well, you don't vote the way we want to, we're not going to count it. How many times have we seen these primaries moved around? Where the Republican Party says, well, you're not going to move your primary, you're going to put it where we want to. And at the end of the election cycle, how many times do you get a vote? You don't get to vote. Here in Arizona, we had two candidates, Ron Paul and Mitt Romney. I couldn't vote for anybody else because they had eliminated, the Republican Party had eliminated them from the ballot.
The same thing here in Texas. Yeah.
And it's okay. Here's what Rump is. Donald Trump is he's pulling political blackmail is what he's doing. He's saying right now, either you vote me as your nominee, or I'm gonna take my football and I'm gonna run third party and I'm gonna mess it up for everybody. So either you better nominate me, or I'm gonna throw the whole party under the freaking bus, and you're gonna get Hillary Clinton. I'm here to tell you.
see, and that's
I'm here to tell you, if Trump is nominated, he's going to lose, because you're going to see constitutional conservatives like us and the evangelical vote either stay home or vote third party, because they will not support him.
and this is exactly what I'm talking about with these individuals that say, well, we have to vote for this person or that person because we've been told to. But they're the same individuals that railed against people like you and I, Nelson, who did vote third party last election. Well, that's what gave us the election. Now they're actually weren't trying to justify that. They're turning around and saying, well, we're going to support Trump if he runs third party. That's just what it is. So they're actually advocating for the very same thing that they were complaining about in 2008 and 2012. We lost the election because people voted third party. Now they're wanting people to vote third party to disrupt the system. That's sociopathic. There's no cure for that except maybe a 3-pound ball-peen hammer.
Well, yeah, and these people have always been contradictory. Stop and think about what they are really about. They don't connect dots. They don't come to conclusions. They just go off of these raw emotionalism, and that's why people like a nerd-faced burn me Sanders or a Hitlery rotten Clinton or even a Marxist Dubio Rubio want. Because they want to manipulate you. You can see Rubio running out there already saying, you're taking away the right of the government to spy on people, but if they had spied on people, that would have prevented Paris. Basically, Ted Cruz caused the terrorist attacks in Paris and in San Bernardino. I get tired of this kind of crap. I get tired of these people trying to sit there and manipulate everything to fit this sort of worldview that they have, and the way that they try and paint us all as if we are these stupid idiots. But maybe the way that the voting population has been dumbed down, they've gotten us to that point now. Remember what Gruber said? He sat there and he said you had to lie to the populace because they're so stupid that they'll buy into it and allow it to go forth. But I seem to recall the population being against it and it just being thrust down our throats. And then I remember a gutless opposition party that failed to do anything to stop it, failed to use their congressional powers to stop it. And people just don't know their constitutional rights enough to know that you can sit there and tell the government no. And that's what we have to do.
And this goes.
What gets me, what gets me, I was one of the first members of the Tea Party. The Tea Party had a plan. And this is what they supported. This is who they could support. Blah 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 blah. They sent Cruz up to the Senate, and Cruz has done everything that he promised he would do. Whether it made him look bad, looked good, or indifferently, he's one of the only ones that have done that. Rubio sure didn't. They supported Rubio wholeheartedly. Yeah, it was better with what the socialist idiot they had, Mr. Kendall with the gray hair, was running against him. But what gets me is they're now against the Tea Party. The Tea Party's against the Tea Party because Trump is the very face of what the Tea Party claimed to be against.
Yeah, yeah. And that too is sociopathic when you stop and think about it. But as you said from your own experience with the Tea Party, it was corrupted. And tying this back into the topic of the show, Lincoln corrupted the Republican Party. People forget about that. That whole little Union Party that you mentioned that he ran with in 1864, that wasn't the Republican Party. He did that because he thought he could get some of the Northern Democrats that weren't the Copperhead wing to join him, but also because he did not want the full abolitionist message that the Republican Party was beginning to embrace. So he split away from his own party and fractured it. So in a way, Trump is a little bit like that, threatening to run third party here as political blackmail. Well, Lincoln was doing that too. But that judge that I mentioned earlier that wrote this article back in 2004, he sat there and he said that, look at how beneficent Lincoln was because he allowed us to have elections in 1862 and 1864 in wartime, when actually, because he had declared martial law, we really shouldn't have had those, and it would have been within his authority to subvert the Constitution there. I'm sorry, but martial law does not completely surpass the Constitution. It just doesn't.
Well, and see, here's the other thing with this too. We can look at this, and the reason the vast majority of these people are dumbed down and complacent because there was something instituted in them, as there was back with Lincoln. Fear was put out into the public. People didn't act against Lincoln that should have, out of a certain level of fear, that fear of reprisal against them. They were afraid of what would happen to them. Was the same thing that happened to Vallandigham and Merryman. Some people were afraid, and just enough people became fearful of that to where they stood by and did nothing. They turned the other cheek or looked away. And then with Obama, with FDR, with Wilson, and now we're seeing it with the political infighting with Trump instituting this fear of, well, like Nelson said, I'll just take my football and go home, and I'll run third party. It's invoking fear as an emotional response, and this is what people need to stop doing. Stop voting with your emotions. Your emotions are screwing everything up. They're getting in the way, and they're clouding your judgment. Start looking at the candidates and vetting them. You want to vet someone like Donald Trump? Look at his past. Look at his actions. Look at everything he has done. Eminent domain. You look at his stance on being pro-abortion, his stance against the Second Amendment, the violations of the Constitution that he himself has done in order to further whom? Himself. What makes people think, or what should make people think, that he would be any different if he's president? If he's willing to do it without having the authority of president, if he has that power, even though it's not much, but it's more than what he has now, what's stopping him from doing it on a larger scale? Nothing, because the complacency is there and people are afraid.
Guys, I running out of power here, so I have to go.
All right.
Conversation, and let's say that Lincoln sucked, and John Wilkes Booth should be a national hero.
I'm going with that. I think we could put John Wilkes Booth and Aaron Burr right up there at the same pedestal as national heroes.
Oh, absolutely. Why don't we put them on Stone Mountain and Mount Rushmore? Since they want to change all our monuments, that's how we got it. That's how we'll do it. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your Captain Randy Wright. I want to thank you for choosing to fly with us here at the Wright Flyer. And let me go ahead and offend some Muslims and some non-Christians and some liberals and wish you all a Merry Christmas. With that said, folks, good night. We'll see you next time.